Well, as the flood waters start to recede in some parts of eastern Canada, people are now getting their first look at the damage left behind. Thousands of homes have been flooded in a number of communities. The cleanup now, well, that could take weeks or even months in some cases. With a look at what's involved in that process is John Pomeroy. He's the director of the Centre of Hydrology at the University of Saskatchewan, and he's our guest from Saskatoon this morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Well, we've been looking at pictures for at least a week now. Thousands of homes in Ontario and Quebec were flooded. Some of those people forced to evacuate. What will they be coming home to?
The really hard part starts now for them. They're coming home to places which have been contaminated with sediment that is washed from upstream. And it may have sewage mixed with it. It may have other things that have been mobilized out of the soil, heavy nutrients, other contaminants. So it's fairly nasty stuff in their homes. And as well, then the other issue is mold and decay in the homes. So there's a tremendous cleanup effort ahead, and it's not going to be fast.
I remember going into some homes after Toronto had some flooding when you had, water up to the main floor, similar to this situation. And there's almost this silt that's left behind that covers everything, like a thin layer of this gray, dusty mud that just doesn't seem to go away.
Yes, I mean, this is what's been eroded from the riverbed and from the floodplains around the houses that's washed through, and it has all kinds of things in it. So so these houses are not necessarily safe. In Calgary, after the floods, it was a big effort to clean out the lower levels of the houses, get that material out on the street where it could dry out, and then get it hauled away.
How long does that process take, John?
You know, the initial mitigation can be done in days to weeks, but really we're looking at months for many of these homes, and then they have to be assessed to see whether they're really safe to return to. Some may be in a state that they're not structurally sound to go back in, and this. More importantly, though, this gives an opportunity now for people and governments to decide whether some of these neighborhoods should continue to exist in the floodplain.
Yeah,
particularly where damage has been severe.
You believe that we should have a national strategy for dealing with floods. What would that look like?
Yes, well, this became very apparent after the Calgary floods in 2013. That flooding actually is not just Calgary. It involved British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the floodwaters washed into Manitoba. So these are multi-provincial events, much as the floods in eastern Canada involve Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, and even aspects of the United States. So what Canada needs is a stronger federal role in overseeing the prediction of floods, the management of floodwaters, and the advice as to building on floodplains and how do we mitigate the structures and the homes that are already in the floodplain.
Well,
and we stand out in G7 countries as not having really a very strong national system for this at all.
John, what do you do then for people who live currently now in a floodplain? If we, allow people not to build there anymore because, the cleanup and recovery has to be covered by the federal government, where do those people go?
Well, what happened in Ontario after Hurricane Hazel was a tremendous relocation of some of these neighborhoods from unsafe areas. And so this does cost money, but over the long term, it costs less money and it's less disruption to people to get them relocated and essentially buy them out so they can find a safer place to live. In other cases, there are engineering structures or water management initiatives. There are dikes. There's ways that you can rebuild the homes to keep them safe, but not always. And sometimes we have to look at the risks involved and say, hey, it's just not sensible to come back.
A lot of frustration this week, in particular by communities in Quebec who are saying, the military was called in too late, too slow of a response. How could we improve here?
Well, flood warning, I don't think there's a flood anywhere in the world where people said, well, we had enough warning, but it's actually improving, and our capability to calculate the risk and the immediate warnings for flood is improving. And this is something that Environment Canada has been developing along with the universities across the country. And what I'd like to see is a greater rollout of this system. Part of this is in response to the floods of 2013. And so we set up the largest water study in the world, Global Water Futures. It's led by the University of Saskatchewan, but has 18 universities across the country, strong involvement of the federal government, to come together and build a national system so we have flood warnings which can be as much as a week or more in some cases. For instance, the floods in eastern Canada, the water conditions that led to those built up over the month of April, which is exceptionally cold and record wet. So even by early April, it was becoming apparent that there was a high risk for flooding. We didn't know when. But then as you get to a few days or weeks or so before, then the weather forecasts become more and more accurate that we're going to have a major event. And you can begin to pinpoint the area and the location and say, hey, we have to be, you have to evacuate in an orderly fashion. You have to start building flood barriers, sandbags, whatever, and the Army has to be ready to move in.
It's an interesting...
So this can be done earlier.
It's an interesting idea. In the same way that we prepare for blizzards in this country, now start to prepare for floods. John Pomeroy, Director of the Center of Hydrology at the University of Saskatchewan, thanks for your time this morning.